Warning, this podcast contains naughty words.
Hello, trekkers. I'm David Greenwood, your host for this episode of Expodition. I've got a really fun podcast lined up for you today as I speak to the creators of the documentary Dugout, Benjamin Saad and James Trundle. The two Brits traveled to the Ecuadorian Amazon to build a canoe from scratch. And by scratch, I mean they start with a huge tree and hollow it out that they'll use to hopefully navigate downriver through the rainforest. But does it float? Ben and James, over to you. Hey, Ben and James, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Yeah, doing well, thanks.
Where are you both dialing in from today?
I'm actually down in Winchester at the moment.
And I'm dialing in from King's Cross, so central London.
And is that the boat you were talking about building in the documentary, James?
Yeah, no, currently on the boat right now. So if you hear some like awkward background noise, that'll be because I'm right next to the tow path and King's Cross is outrageously busy. If anything, it's one of the worst spots of late. I have lost so much sleep through drunken people partying on the bench right next to my boat. So I'm looking forward to leaving this spot.
Is that because you've been going out and joining them, James? Such a party animal.
Oh yeah, it's because I'm just too wild. That's the issue. And I think that word got out that the party's at my boat, and now I can't stop them from like visiting. It's a nightmare.
So what was the address, James? Where did you say it was parked?
I'll be gone by the time this goes live, don't worry. Definitely gone.
Great. Well, thanks for both of you joining me today. And I'm really excited to talk about the film Dugout that you created. I'm really fascinated by the way people get together and embark on these journeys and come up with these plans. In the film, you talked about both of you embarking on a lot of journeys before you went out to the Amazon and filming Dugout. And one of the things that really caught my interest was riding a sofa across southern England. Maybe you can talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. That's just one of our first films we made, probably. And that sort of stemmed, I was between things. I was working as a painter and decorator in Bournemouth. And the owner of the flat I was decorating had an old sofa. And he was like, can you just get rid of that? So I was like, yeah, sure. So I phoned James. I was like, James, how do you feel about dragging this sofa around? And he was like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And then he constructed a sort of collapsible frame that we could put under the sofa and squidged it into the back of, what was your car then? Like another Metro or something?
I think it was yours, wasn't it? Peugeot like 106.
Yes, I drove up in my tiny little car, and then we sort of crammed everything in and then set off from Bournemouth and finished in Brighton 3 days later, having sort of towed and ridden our sofa across the Isle of Wight.
So how do you go from riding a sofa across the Isle of Wight to ending up in the Amazon rainforest? How does a journey like that come about?
Well, obviously a lot of like chance, but Ben edited that journey into a 3.5 minute film, and it was like really quaint and whimsical, and it's a really simple thing to digest. And by chance, we just got into a few film festivals. Ben threw it out really late in the day, so we weren't in any programs, but we were invited to show it at some film festivals. And it was only then that we really started to contemplate adventure travel as a genre of filmmaking. I mean, like, this is just a great excuse. Like, the sofa thing was always about making a film, but we were like, oh, we can push this further. We can use this idea of making a film as an excuse to go on an adventure. And then we just spent a lot of time watching films, understanding what we loved, what we could bring to sort of the genre, and then just like speaking probably for maybe an additional 1.5 years. Like, we made another film as well, which was slightly less successful. And then we were like, no, we just need to go big. We just need to like choose something. And it got to a point where we were like, well, what can we do? What are we good at? And it was a really short list. It was like not very much. So we would just have one clear passion, and that's just making things. So we're like, well, we wanted to make a film where it is a bit more static so we could get to know a community, and we wanted to make a film that was about craftsmanship. So we were like, what one thing can we do that would that's sort of simple, almost a one-liner. We're like, let's just build a dugout canoe with an indigenous community. And that was the seed. And then once we sort of had that that idea in our head, nothing else was really needed to be contemplated. We just needed to make it happen.
Going back slightly there, in finding an indigenous community, it's not something I imagine you can go onto Facebook and put into the search bar and find a group of people you want to go and live with.
No, so I'd been making films for a travel research company that has projects all around the world, and I'd visited several of their sites. And how they operate is they always have a local partner organization, and in Ecuador that is an eco lodge, which is helping bring work to the Guarani community. And I reached out to them and I was just like, yeah, we want to make a dugout canoe. What do you think? Could we do it around there? And they replied pretty quickly and were like, that sounds like a really cool idea. And then there are a few emails and they were like, yeah, just go to this village called Apaica. There's a guy called Bai there who speaks some Spanish. He's a really nice guy. He'll help you. And then sort of 6 months later, we basically turned up in Apaica and Bai was like, oh yeah, I've been expecting you. And yeah, that was it. So we got really lucky, actually.
And did you have any woodworking skills before you went out to the Amazon?
Yes and no. Like working with a freshly felled tree, so it's like green woodworking, is a very different type of woodworking that we were both familiar with. Like I had trained as a professional woodworker by then, and I had done a lot of sort of classic furniture construction, building my boat and actually doing other things as well. So yes, I was familiar with the material, but when it came to green woodworking, I think the odd whittled spoon is all we had actually achieved before we went. So we hadn't used axes in that way. So it was just on a scale that we had no experience with. We did by chance visit a guy that had made his own dugout canoe for some sort of insight, and that was based in Durham. So we went up there, we spent a day with him. We sort of really got to know his process. But what was interesting is that when we were in the Amazon, everything he told us, because he was making it up as he went along, was actually almost completely irrelevant. And Bai, who's made not hundreds, but many dugout canoes, and this is his everyday. He showed us how a person genuinely does it in the sort of the wilderness. So it was almost like going back to sort of square one and learning from that point, which was definitely what we wanted. So to acquire the knowledge in sort of the most organic way you could.
Yeah, and Bai definitely sort of took us under his wing and like taught us exactly what to do. And yeah, without him, it would have been a very different canoe.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that really struck me about the film. I went into it browsing Amazon, and after a recommendation from a friend, expecting a typical adventure documentary, right? Where you get 2 minutes in, the characters in the film have been introduced, and you get straight into the canoeing adventure or the hike. And the film you guys created was slightly different.
Yeah, I think we were always expecting a sort of 50-50 split of like building and then going on the journey. But yeah, what we didn't expect was how much we would be involved in the family. We kind of thought that they might be like, yeah, there's your tree, get on with it. You can camp out there as well. And we don't really want you in our community. So that was just an amazing addition to it. And then because that was such a rich thing that we were sort of invited into, that extended the first half of the film into the first 3/4 of the film, which is why the sort of journey section is so short, because it was so interesting and so fun being with that community. It was actually really difficult to leave because we were just having such a good time, and it was so fascinating and interesting what we were experiencing there.
Like it's funny because before we went out, having watched a lot of adventure films by that point, we used to watch a lot of climbing films, but we didn't really branch out from that. So we did spend some time sort of imagining the sort of film that we wanted to make. And we always found that the problem is with a lot of adventure films, it's so much about the journey that everyone's always passing through. So they'll pass through a village and they'll engage with the community, but it will be such a fleeting encounter. You question how genuine sort of the portrayal can be. So we really wanted to give us the time to actually capture a community honestly, so we could, and also to prioritize the filming, so we could really take our time to understand how they live and then capture that as effectively and as beautifully as possible. So we always knew that that was hopefully gonna, but you can never predict. Yeah, the fact that they embraced us the way that they did was very fortunate, but it took time. You know, you can't tell so much from the film, but for the first week we were less integrated, but as our novelty wore off, they started to incorporate us much more sort of naturally, and everything they did, they would invite us to go along, and then we would share activities. So equally we would do things for them and, you know, try and assist. So we were trying to, I don't know, address some of the issues that we felt there were with the, you know, the genre of adventure travel filmmaking, where it's less about us and more about them.
One of the best shots for me anyway in the whole film was the felling of the tree. It must have taken you a long time to cut down that tree, because on the film it looks quite awe-inspiring. In person, I imagine it was much, much more impressive.
Yeah, it was a pretty incredible thing. Just, yeah, when it came down, well, it took quite a long time. How long did it take? It's like it was only a day, actually. It was quite quick. As partly just because Bai was working on one side of the tree and we were working together on the other side. And then obviously it fell towards the side that he'd been working on because he was so much faster than us, even just by himself. But yeah, when it came down, like it was like the lights came on because it had pulled down so much canopy with it, and the ground was just like this huge vibration of the impact. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty surreal actually. I can almost, even though we only caught it from one angle, I can still visualize and reimagine that moment so clearly now, because it's something that is, you know, it's sort of also upsetting to observe, but it's sort of surreal and awe-inspiring, and sort of it makes you feel very small all of a sudden. So I felt very lucky to be able to experience that moment. So yeah, it was crazy.
And you go from a huge tree felled on the forest floor to starting to craft it out. Now, you've mentioned that it wasn't quite the experience or the work you're expecting, having come from inside a nice workshop in England. How long did the process take to actually go from a tree that's been felled to creating that hollowed out canoe?
So we were living with the community for, I think it was about 5 weeks. But then a lot of that time we'd sort of go and work on the canoe pretty much every day, but it would just be for the morning or the afternoon. And then in the afternoon, we would go out with Bai and go and gather things that he needed. So whether it was food or building materials to repair their living space, or a specific type of vine that they could use to make the poison for their blow darts, or a fishing trip with the whole family. So although it was 5 weeks, it was sort of spread out over that 5 weeks. It wasn't like intense work for 5 weeks. But yeah, 5 weeks, simple answer.
Yeah, simple answer, but I'm sure, well, I know that there's a lot in that 5 weeks. Was there any point when you were building it, you just thought, is this going to float?
There were a few bits, like when you're working down the edges, when they're getting a bit thinner and you're sort of chopping in towards them, and you're like, well, if I, one like overexcited axe swing, and then there's just going to be a big hole in the side of our canoe. And then when we burnt it as well, like that was pretty like, what the, is this going to be okay? And then seeing it afterwards with these like big cracks running down the middle of it, and be like, oh my God, it is actually just going to sink when it goes in the water. But just having that reassurance from Bai that, don't worry, they'll close again when they put it in the water. And then it did leak as soon as we put it in the water, but you just shove a bit of t-shirt in there and just like jam it in with a machete point, and then it's fine again. But yeah, and then bits where you try and pick it up and you're like, this bit of wood still weighs like half a ton. Like, how can this float? This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And even, are we going to know if it floats? Because we might not even be able to get it to the fucking river.
Yeah, and that's one of the scenes in the film with everyone dragging it down to the river and all the family coming to help. I think that's when you really see the breadth of the community, that it wasn't just but there was actually quite a large village involved in this project, or involved in the community.
Yeah, well, the majority of the time it was just Bai and Beva and one of their grandkids, and that's because most of his daughters and son-in-laws, they all have to go up to a different village to take the kids to school. Basically, there's a rule of like you have to have a certain number of children in your community before you're allowed a teacher that's provided by the state, and they didn't have enough children, but they had the school building, but they couldn't educate them there, so they went 2 hours upstream to a larger community to go to school. So during the week it was just 5 of us in that community, and then at the weekends, like his 4 daughters and their husbands and all their kids would come back. Wow. And then it was suddenly like this huge influx of people we didn't know and like didn't know us, and we're like, we're suddenly like back to being like the outsiders again, and like having to like ease our way back into the community.
When it got to the part where you were launching Canoe and had started the journey down the river, there was a bit, I can't remember if it was Ben or you, James, that fell into the water. And there was almost this sudden turn in the film where it was a realization that actually what we're doing is quite dangerous. And if something goes wrong, no easy way out of this. Was that a real worry for you going into the trip, the safety aspect?
So yes and no. Like, we thought about some safety elements, but because the trip was sort of ill-defined, as in we were the first people that ever did a trip like this that we knew of. Like, so we took things like an emergency beacon. So that felt like a really great way of getting rescued. But we didn't take any buoyancy aids. That seems really foolish. And I think for us, we wanted that. So we didn't want to overthink it, because we felt like that would reduce some of the spontaneity. And sometimes you think about something too long, it doesn't even happen because you can overthink it and you think there's too many risks. So we were very happy to be a little blasé, and we got through it. So it's like, well, maybe we did just get it right. When I fell in, because it was me, that really did scare me, because I thought, okay, shit, things could go wrong really quickly, and me drowning an emergency beacon isn't going to help that. It's just going to help. Someone's going to come collect my body. So that was a bit of a reality check. But then after that moment passed and we got a little more comfortable on the water, and actually conditions got better, because our launch day, the conditions were particularly bad, and Bai was sort of quite hesitant to let us go. It became very comfortable again. And you want a degree of risk, otherwise it's not an adventure, it's just a holiday. And most of the time it did feel like a holiday. So it's a fine line, isn't it?
The day before we left, there'd been a huge flood in that area. There'd been loads of rain, and the river was like a couple of meters higher than it had been.
Wow.
And we were like, "Bai, do you think we should leave today?" And he was like, "No, if you leave today, you'll die." So we left the next day and nearly died instead.
So you mentioned it not being like a holiday, which I don't think could be described anywhere near a holiday at all. Not least because throughout the film, there's this one persisting factor, and that is illness. It didn't seem like you guys were in the best of shape throughout the trip.
Yeah, the moment that they stopped preparing our food like foreigners, and they just let us eat what they ate, was the moment that we started to get ill. And I don't think we got more ill, I just think we got cumulatively fatigued by illness. Mm-hmm. So I was never worried to the point that I assumed that we would get better eventually, but it just added an extra layer of discomfort. But equally, I don't know, we sort of mused that if you're going to have the shits, being in a place where you can literally shit anywhere is probably the best place to have it. So it was never that inconvenient. It's not like you ran to the toilet, you literally just did it. So it was fine. I think Ben suffered a bit more. I'll let Ben tell you about his suffering.
I don't know. Mine came later though. I think there's quite a lot of, when I was editing the film, where I had to relive it all, obviously, with all these interviews and like sort of the daily poo updates from each of us. So James spent the first month like going between Imodium and Senecot to sort of like try and control his bowel movements. And it went from like yellow cowpats to gold bars because we ate so many bananas. But yeah, definitely on the journey section, mine was much worse. But like it was in our campsite, you just see these little white little toilet roll bits like all over the place where each of us had been, and you have to leave the toilet paper there so the other person knows where like not to go. But yeah, it was sort of comical as opposed to like horrendous. Like it wasn't like, oh my god, I'm gonna die. It was just like, well, this is a bit uncomfortable and a bit annoying.
And on the subject of death, when you were floating down the river, the part where you talk about other tribes in the region and the risk of potentially being blowpiped through traveling over their lands, did you encounter any other people along the journey?
Not really, no. So, well, there was one bit where we got to the bridge, which we mentioned in the thing, and we did meet a few people, and they were like, "What do? You can't go down there. You'll get lost." And we were like, "Well, how are we going to get lost? You just keep going down it until you get to the end." But no, we didn't encounter anyone who was unfriendly at all. James, can you remember anything?
Yeah, well, I suppose that was one of our best illustrations of how ill prepared we were, because we basically got the opportunity to build this canoe, which we took, and then only when we arrived did we realise that we built a canoe on a river that we're not allowed to paddle down. So that's why the film has this really odd narrative where all of a sudden it's on the back of a pickup truck, because we wanted to respect the community. Yes, it could have maybe been a slightly more anxious adventure film, and we did debate this for a long time. But we wanted to do the right thing, and the right thing wasn't to go through the intangible zone. It was to avoid a community that wants to be isolated. So we did that, and as a result, we found ourselves on a river that we weren't allowed to be on. We got told that we should have permits, and we only knew about that when we had sort of almost completed our journey. So again, sometimes not knowing, not preparing allows you to have a genuine excuse for doing something you're not meant to.
So even in the Amazon, you need a permit to go down the river.
Yeah, absolutely. The river that we were on, we actually passed a couple of research stations, and they were very accommodating, but they were like, you can't film here, you can't formally be here. And so that sort of illustrated to us that we were out of place a little bit, but that no one was ever sort of hostile about it. It's just that they are the rules, so the system isn't abused, and we did what we could make sure that we didn't, which panned out just fine. And then we got pulled over right at the end by the military, and we thought that's when we were going to get told off for the sort of not having any permits. But actually, they just wanted to make sure we weren't poaching, which we weren't. And then they obviously wanted to buy a really sexy canoe, which they did. So that worked out really well.
Yeah, and that was the heartbreaking bit of the film. It seemed such a quick experience from having spent so long building this thing to getting rid of it. It just felt to me as if it must have been quite hard for you guys to give it up, even though that process was so quick.
Yeah,
I suppose we always prepared ourselves that we would give it away. I think there is a good chance that if things hadn't have panned out the way that they did, we would have literally just given it away or abandoned it, because we had no way of doing anything else with it. We talked about lots of other options, but realistically, we had a flight to catch and we would have had to left it. So it was actually, fortunate that a local man bought the canoe and he will use it for his family. So it probably lasted another year where it actually worked as a canoe in sort of a community that he values. So I think actually it couldn't have been a more poetic end. Oh, well, maybe if we'd given it back to Bai, that would have been poetic.
Then you would have had to go back up the river.
Second best.
Yeah, and there's no way we're going back up that river. That was quite fast.
Have you heard from the person that bought it since filming?
No, we've not heard from him at all. And it really was like in how it is in the film. It was that quick. It was sort of, shit, we found someone that wants to buy it. He's giving us some money and we've got to unload it. And then a boat is waiting to take us down to the border to get our permits, or not our permits, get our passport stamps, and then get on another boat. And even just leaving that area took like 4 days of sort of pretty much just continuous travel in various kinds of motorized boat, just to get somewhere where we could get a bigger boat to then get a flight. So it was still incredibly remote, but it was so quick, that like transition from like we're in our canoe by ourselves, we pulled over, we've been paid, and we've left. It was a bit of a shock how quick it was.
So the trip is over, guys. You're on the plane home, arrive back in the UK, and it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month later. Are you looking back at the trip, raring to go on another adventure, thinking of new places to explore? Talk me through the mindset of coming down from a journey like that.
Well, it's funny because, like, and Ben mentions it briefly in the film, that even when you're on an amazing place like that, doing a trip that has a degree of hardship, you're always thinking about home. So there's sort of a honeymoon period when you get home that you're just quite happy to enjoy the home comforts, to eat the things that you've been imagining. And then I think we both had a lot to do. Like, I had to go back to university, and so I was instantaneously distracted by my return. So I didn't have that much time to contemplate it. I think it's only later when we started to watch the edits, and you sort of, it makes you, and obviously the way the film's edited, it's sort of the best bits.
Right. And I imagine just filming it whilst you're out there is a real tough challenge, and something that you've got to stay very motivated on.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's probably one of the most sort of challenging bits of the film, and like of the project was, making the film about it. And it sort of adds a level of stress to everything as well, because you're like, well, we've got to film this, but I want to just sit here and enjoy what I'm doing as well, and like enjoy this moment. But oh my gosh, should we be filming it? Should we be filming it? Are we missing something? Do we need this? And then the other side of that is like just trying to keep everything charged and working and dry in a rainforest where it's pissing with rain every day.
How much kit got damaged and broken?
I think the only things that didn't recover was a lens and a camera and a microphone. I think that's it. It's quite a lot.
Not bad going for a long time in the rainforest. And are there any big trips on the horizon post-lockdown? Anything you two have been discussing?
Yeah, well, we've been talking a bit recently, for the last 2 years probably, about doing another trip. And we were sort of making quite good progress into like actually getting around to doing it. And then, all the lockdown and everything's happened, and we've basically cancelled. And we just don't know with international travel at the moment, like the countries we've been thinking of going to are still totally closed, and you can't even go and do 2 weeks in quarantine. It's just like a no-go, no flights, no transport, anything. So
yeah, I think we want to make another one last film before we get too old with too many responsibilities. We get too like physically decrepit, which is like winging its way towards me rapidly. It's sort of, it'd be good to sort of almost, although we're a bit worried because Dugout went so well that it'd be hard to, it might be just best to leave it and be like, that was the one great film, we'll leave it like that.
Go out on a high.
Yeah, we'll see what destiny allows us to do. If an opportunity presents itself, then we'll take it.
This wave. It's 5 years later and we're still going, so we'll just let's keep enjoying Dugout. It's great.
Yeah, I know, it's outrageous. The fact that we're still getting any sort of response after 5 years is mental.
Well, it is a great film, guys, and I really, really enjoyed watching it. I would recommend it to anyone, whether you have an adventurous streak or whether they're just sitting on the sofa and want something to watch on a Saturday night. But really, thanks very much for talking to me today. And I do hope the next adventure isn't too far away, or at least before, as you say, James, you get old and decrepit.
So I'm already old and decrepit. That's already arrived.
Well, enjoy your retirement on the boat. But again, thanks for
That's it. Thank you.
I really enjoyed recording that episode. Two really cool gentlemen. You can watch Dugout on Amazon Prime now or at dugoutadventure.com. The two are still working on creative projects. James is now a furniture maker in London as one part of Porter and Trundle. Ben continues to make films, amongst other things. You can see some of his work at trail2anywhere.com. See you downstream in a few weeks' time for the next adventure. Bye.